This is video 3 in the social psych series, and as I mentioned, we are picking up discussing the Milgram experiment. You may be familiar with the Milgram experiment. It's one of the most famous psychology experiments ever, definitely one of the most popular social psychology ones. So here was the setup for the Milgram experiment. If you haven't heard of this, you're looking at the screen wondering what on earth you're looking at. Let me actually maximize myself. You don't need the screen yet. All right, so here is the setup of the Milgram experiment. Say I'm the researcher, okay? And then I have a room of people sitting in front of me, and I call you and one other person to the front. Let's call him Tom. I call you and Tom up to the front. And I say, okay, Tom, I have 2 pieces of paper in my hand. One says teacher, one says learner. Draw a piece of paper at random. Both the papers say teacher on them. But Tom's in on it. Tom's with me, right? So you draw it, and I say, okay, what do you have? And you say, I have teacher. Tom, what do you have? I have learner. All right, follow me back here. So what we do is I tell you, all right, this study is based off of the theory that if somebody is in fear, they can learn more easily because they're afraid of something bad happening to them if they don't learn what's going on. So you're going to say a list of words to Tom. And every time Tom gets a word wrong, he's just going to get a little bit of an electric shock. And each time he gets a word wrong, the shock is going to get a little bit more and more and more intense. And eventually, Tom's going to get to the point that he's so scared of getting shocked that he's going to start getting more and more words right out of that fear of not wanting to get shocked. Sound good? Tom says, yeah, sure, I'm game. You say, yeah, okay, I'm good. So then I take you to a setup that looks like this. So we walk back here. You see Tom get hooked up to all the devices that's around the corner, so you can't see it happening, right? He gets hooked up to this device that I tell you is going to give him an electric shock, and you are sat down in front of a panel that looks something like this. And I tell you, okay, each of these buttons is a little bit stronger of a shock than the one before. And some of these you can't really see it really well. I'm linking an actual video because Milgram Video recorded this. I'm linking an actual video of this study on our course page for this week. But some of these say like extreme intensity shock, intense shock, danger, severe shock, and each button is an increased level of shock. And so then I, as the experimenter, sit down at the table to record my findings about how well Tom is learning the material. So here's where this becomes an obedience thing, right? You've just met me, but you think that I'm the experimenter running this study. Tom's a complete stranger. As Tom gets answers wrong, which obviously I've told him to do for the sake of the study, you keep shocking him. Eventually you get to a point on the board where Tom begins pleading with you to stop. This hurts more than I thought it would. I'm really in pain. This really hurts. Please stop. Please don't shock me anymore. Please stop. And keeps going and going and going. At one point, he actually screams out in pain. Well, you're sitting there becoming more uncertain. Like, am I actually hurting this guy? And I, as the experimenter, am just sitting there taking notes, saying, nope, you're good. Keep going, keep going, keep going. And if you begin to hesitate, I put pressure on you. You can't stop now. I mean, you'll ruin this round of my study if you stop right now. We have to keep going. I need to see what the results of this are going to be. Over half of the participants went all the way to the end of the chalkboard, even when the person in the other room was screaming in pain and begging for them to stop. This was the Milgram Obedience Study. It was showing, and the Milgram Obedience Study was actually inspired by the war crimes with the Holocaust. It was inspired by whenever people were being tried for being workers in the concentration camps and being responsible for the torture and death of so many people. And everyone was sitting there in shock. Like, how could this person be involved in that? They were my neighbor. They helped carry groceries to the elderly neighbor. Like, how is it possible that this person was responsible for the death of other people? And that was one of the big motives behind Milgram's study, is how easy would it actually be to convince somebody to hurt another person? if they thought that they were being given even a semi-reasonable justification for doing so by somebody in authority. And again, they found out that over half the people went all the way, even whenever the person was screaming and pleading with them to stop. The participants in the study, obviously this is highly unethical. We can never redo this today. The participants in this study had extreme emotional distress afterwards, that they would have actually been willing to hurt somebody, because you don't know me. I don't actually play a role in your life, right? I can't get you fired from your job. I can't fine you. I can't actually do anything that's detrimental to your life. I just told you with some guilt involved, hey, I'm the researcher. I'm in charge here. I know what I'm doing. You're going to ruin my study if you stop. And they did. And so there was a lot of emotional distress that resulted from that. But so that's the Milgram obedience study. And it showed that people will go along with instructions the majority of the time. So the last part, part 4, is stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and all of those isms. So a stereotype. A stereotype is a set of characteristics that are presumed to be shared by all members of a social category or group. Remember how we talked about that attitudes have a cognitive component, an emotional component, and a behavioral component. A stereotype is that cognitive component. I'm assuming that all members of a social category share this particular characteristics. Now, here's the thing. We all have stereotypes. It is how the brain works. Our brain wants to create shortcuts and put things into categories and assign generalities, right? It's just how our brain does things. Having a stereotype does not make you a bad person. It means your brain is working the way that all human brains work. A stereotype can be positive or negative. You can have a positive generalized assumption about a group of people. And a lot of times we're unaware that we formed a stereotype until we have a conscious thought that reflects that stereotype. And you sit there thinking, wait a minute, where did that come from? That's how stereotypes work. There's something that's called an implicit association, also called an automatic stereotype activation. And that's basically saying, because of the way that our brain categorizes things, these are going to come up automatically without any cognitive effort on our part. Now, there's some really interesting research about if you can change or overcome a stereotype. And the answer is, yeah, you can. But it takes a lot of mental effort. There's actually quite a few cognitive and mental exercises that you have to go through to get there. So again, stereotypes by themselves are not the problem. Stereotypes are the normal way that your brain works. When you become aware that you hold a stereotype, you should be willing to challenge it, right? Because there's no group where every single person is exactly the same. But having stereotypes is not a problem. It's the way the brain works. Just be willing to challenge them once you become aware of them. Prejudice and discrimination are where we become more problematic. Okay. A prejudice is a prejudgment of a person. It usually refers to a hostile or negative attitudes or feelings. Again, this is the feeling component of attitudes, right? Cognitive, feeling, and behavior. This is the feeling part. Negative feelings towards an individual based on their membership in a group. Now, because psychologists will argue about everything, there's actually some debate in psychology about if a positive prejudice should still be considered a prejudice, right? If I have an automatic positive happy feeling towards you because of a group that you belong to, is that a prejudice? But usually the term refers to negativity. So it's a negative, hostile attitude towards an individual because of their membership in a group. Discrimination is when I go even a step further than that, and now I'm getting to the behavioral parts. It's when I actually act on my negative attitudes towards a group, and now I treat a group unfairly. I engage in a negative action towards them, a negative behavior towards them, or unfair behavior towards them. So that's the behavioral component. So the stereotype is the cognitive thought, the prejudice is the feeling, and the discrimination is the behavior. These three terms are not interchangeable. So here's a chart. Now, full disclosure, I actually lifted this chart from a different Intro to Psych textbook, but I thought it was very helpful. So again, the stereotype is the cognitive. It's the overgeneralized belief. And an example would be that group of people are arrogant and obnoxious. The prejudice is, whoops, too fast. The prejudice is the feelings about the group. Not only do I think they're arrogant and obnoxious, I hate them and they make me angry. And discrimination is acting upon it. I would never hire or be friends with or whatever else anybody if they belonged to that group. So the types of prejudice. There is racism, which is based on membership in a racial or ethnic group. There is sexism, which is based on sex. There is ageism, which is based on age. There is homophobia or transphobia, which is based on their LGBTQ identity. So homophobia would be identifying as gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer. Transphobia would be against individuals who identify as transgender, non-binary, genderqueer. And then classism would be based on social class or income. So one interesting debate that this kind of gets into is, are there certain situations where a favoritism for or against one group would not actually be an ism, right? If a company maybe doesn't publish this, but the way that they want to do it is, maybe they're a technology company and they say that they really only want to hire people under age 40 because statistically people under age 40 keep up with the latest technology trends better, and everybody else is going to take the company more seriously if they have younger adults working for them. So that wouldn't be ageism not to hire the 65-year-old who applied for the job. It's just common sense that the younger person is going to know more. Please hear the sarcasm in my voice. That the younger person is going to know more about all of the technology than the older person. So we have every right to cut off our hiring age, right? Is that ageism? Or is that just the right of that company to make that call? If you have, we're in Missouri, I can use this example. If you have a farm store that stocks a lot of soil, fertilizer, feed, and all that, and they want to hire men because there are 60-pound bags of feed that need moved back and forth all day long. And the owner says, you know what, statistically, I could hire a high school student, a college student to work part-time, and they would be more likely to be able to go grab those and carry them without help than hiring a female high school student or college student. And that's actually based on a real example that one of my students had told me about that created a controversy in the small town that they went to high school in. Because one of the farm stores would only hire the high school boys and not the high school girls because of how much heavy equipment that they had to move as part of their job. But is that sexism? Is it actually discrimination? Or is it a logical call based on that manager's perception of the purpose of the job, right? And those are all discussions that'd be really fun to have if we were having an in-person class. But it is something to think about when we talk about a manifestation of a prejudice. Where is the line between I am validly excluding a group of people for a reason versus I'm being discriminatory towards them and holding a stereotype? Are there women out there who could very easily carry a 60-pound bag of feed? Absolutely. Absolutely. Are there individuals who are in their 60s that enjoy keeping up with technologies and still get the latest iPhone and iPad and upgrade their laptop every year? Absolutely there are, right? So at what point does something become a discrimination or a prejudice versus at what point could it be a valid exclusion? And that's just something to think about. It's an interesting topic, and it's something that we debate quite a bit when we get into the equal employment realm. Your book doesn't really get into industrial organizational psychology, which is psychology in the workplace, but this overlaps with that field in really interesting ways. So just something to think about. And that is, one more thing. Why do stereotypes persist? One is because of self-fulfilling prophecies. If we think we're expected to act a certain way because of the group that we're in, sometimes we actually start acting that way, and that perpetuates stereotypes. The other is the confirmation bias, which is that we tend to seek out information that supports our stereotypes, and we ignore information that does not. That's why media portrayals of some things can be really dangerous, because the more we see facts and stories and spins that support our own perspective, the more we reinforce them and the harder they ever become to break. And research has actually shown that we remember things that support our viewpoints more accurately than we remember things that don't. And that is social psychology.